Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this conversation. I can see the number of participants rising by the second, but I'm going to start an introduction now. I hope you don't miss too much. I know the number will be getting into the hundreds, at least it's in the hundreds already. So welcome to this event, which is, of course, being organised by Village Books of Dulwich, by the Seven Oaks Bookshop, and by the Chorleywood and Gerrard's Cross bookshops. And I'm particularly excited that we're doing this for four really, splendid independent bookshops who do such a great service to us all, and from whom you can purchase not only Unpresidented by Jon Sopel, but, if I'm allowed to say it, On the Road by me, which will be coming out in paperback edition at the end of next month. But at least it means I know something about what I'm talking about to my old friend Sopel. Now, Jon, as you will know, if you've ever watched television or listened to the radio in the last 100 years, you will realize is American editor of the BBC, and he's been covering Washington and all the works of the United States for us since 2014, but of course was a correspondent and presenter for many years before that, starting his serious life in the BBC at Westminster. So there's no one he doesn't know. There isn't a political event that he hasn't witnessed. But I dare say that when we begin this conversation, which I think we should do now, Jon, as the numbers go up, and we've got well into 700 people joining us already and more coming every second, that we're talking about a period since, let's say, Donald Trump's decision to go into politics in 2015, a period which, even for you, with your love of melodrama and your knowledge of it, have seen nothing like before.
No, and I don't think anyone has seen anything like it before. I was talking, well, first of all, can I just say good evening to everybody? And Jim, it's lovely to be talking to you. And thank you, all of you, wherever you are. And, you know, I hope it's not a dreary evening in the UK in January. I'm sure it is. It's a beautiful, bright, crisp, freezing cold day in Washington. I was talking to our friend Jim, Jonathan Friedland, who presents The Long View on Radio 4. And he was saying to me that the thesis of their programme is that don't think it hasn't been seen before, everything has been seen before. And they came up against Trump and thought, oh no, there is nothing to compare it to. And I mean, maybe I'll start in January, you know, earlier on this month, because it is only earlier on this month. It feels like 5 years ago, because the events and speed with which the chaos unfolds is so extraordinary. I came back to the UK for Christmas. I flew back British Airways on January the 3rd to Washington. And because I wanted to check up on football scores, I hooked up to the plane's Wi-Fi. I hook up to the plane's Wi-Fi and see that the Washington Post has a leak of the conversation between the president and Brad Raffensperger, who is the Secretary of State for Georgia. Not only do they have the leak, they have the full transcript of the conversation and the audio file. Now that is extraordinary. But in terms, you hear the president, and I'll say it again, of the United States saying out loud, give me the 11,780 votes I need so that I win Georgia. That is de facto election interference, which is an offense. So I thought on this plane journey, oh my God, nothing is going to eclipse that this week. This is going to be the story that's going to keep us going all week. And by Wednesday, we had the storming of Congress, the most troubling episode, I would argue, in America's democratic history.
Well, I think what's fascinating about this, Jon, is that the ramifications of that event on Capitol Hill on the 6th of January are really profound. Now, it may well be that people are right when they say it's gone off the boil for a moment, that all the things that were being said in the days afterwards have slightly cooled down, and that in terms of the second impeachment effort, the trial in the Senate is going to see a lot of Republicans saying, well, we deprecate what he did, but perhaps we won't go as far as voting for impeachment. That may all be true, but it strikes me that the depth of the shock of that event, even for people who felt, well, I'm going to be a bit loyal and say, well, you know, I'm not going to blame him for everything. But it seems to me that it did get to the core of what a lot of people thought was inviolable in the American system. And, one of the things, I've got a series on the state of America starting in Radio 4 on Monday evening, 8 o'clock, if you want to listen, called After Trump. And talking to some people about this, Jon, I'm very struck by one thing. You and I know 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the number of people in the States who, when there was a bit of trouble, would invoke the Civil War as a parallel was minuscule. You'd never hear it. Now, the number of people who, unprompted, will say this is one of the biggest tests that American democracy has faced since the Civil War in the 1860s is legion. People say it all the time. And what's more, they mean it. Do you find that too?
I think that the degree of polarization, it is hard to exaggerate. The Civil War was fought between North and South. This isn't between North and South. It's the suburbs, it's the cities, it's college educated, it's non-college educated, it's black and it's white to some extent, a pretty large extent. The fault lines are really complicated across America. It's gun-loving, gun-hating, it's, college educated women versus non, etc. So it doesn't fall into a neat delineation. On that day, on the 6th of January, I went to the Ellipse, which is the parkland just to the south of the White House that sort of goes in a straight line to the Washington Monument. And that's where Trump was going to be addressing the crowds. I've been covering Trump rallies, dozens of Trump rallies over the years. And the thing that I've always found about them is that they adore him, but they know that he tells a story. He may fiddle his taxes, he may cheat on his wives, you can't take literally what he says, but he's our guy, he's got our backs. And there was a kind of comedic element to it, of the affection that they felt. And that Wednesday, all the comedy had gone. The only truth that could be trusted in America on that horrible morning was the truth that came from Donald Trump's lips. They had gone from being a kind of very warm, fond fans to being almost cult-like in their devotion to what he was saying. And frankly, I was there and I tweeted out that morning at 11 o'clock in the morning, this feels a little bit scary. This does feel, there is an edge and a tension. And although I've been called fake news, although I've been jostled at rallies, I've thought pretty much it's lighthearted. And there was nothing lighthearted about the mood of the people who were there. And I interviewed two guys who were dressed in like this RoboCop uniform. And I said, it looks like you're dressing for trouble. And they went, and they had driven from Boise, Idaho to be at this rally. I mean, Boise, Idaho is a long, long way away.
Drive, everything.
Yeah. From Washington, D.C. And they said, well, if trouble comes, we're ready for it. I would later see him, his arm up, dangling from the balcony of the Senate, about to jump down onto the Senate floor. These were people who needed little prompting, but they were prompted. And Donald Trump told them to fight like hell. They've got to fight otherwise their country will cease to exist. They've got to be strong. They mustn't be weak. And yet there was one line in that speech where Donald Trump was on autocue and said, called for peaceful protest. But the rest of it, taken in context, was a call to arms. And initially, Donald Trump loved it.
Well, Rudy Giuliani, his personal lawyer, said at that same rally that you've described graphically for us, this is trial by combat. That's the word he used.
Yeah.
Combat.
So there was absolutely, that was the atmosphere that was being stoked up. And the problem that Donald Trump's got is that a lot of the people who were interviewed afterwards were confirming the impeachment charge. The impeachment charge is incitement of insurrection. And they were saying, well, we did this because Donald Trump told us to.
Yeah, exactly. Not very helpful.
So I mean, Donald Trump's defense is problematic, to say the least. Not and made more difficult because no mainstream lawyers are going anywhere near it. One, because they don't want to, and two, because they fear they might not get paid. And so there is, I think, some lawyer from South Carolina who was previously unknown, who's going to be leading the legal team for Trump's second impeachment trial.
Jon, I want to continue that rather later in our conversation to what happens to that chunk of the electorate that is still not bought the fact that they lost the election. But I want to first to go back. What I should say to all the readers, potential readers who've joined us tonight, is that the book is in effect a diary. Jon's written, I think, 2 other books on his time in the States. This is the third, and it really is a story of the election year. That's what it's about, and it brings us right up to those days after the result, when it was being challenged by the president. And I want to take you back, Jon, to the year that we've just seen. What for you were the moments that marked that year out? And I should say to everybody watching and listening that you can, by clicking on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, send in a question, and at about 10 past, 8:15, we're going to pick some of the questions and dive into them. But for the moment, give us a couple of the highlights that for you tell the story of 2020.
The story of 2020 is the start of the whole process. Iowa, New Hampshire, always the starting point of a US presidential election. And I thought, do I have the right to go back over my diary entries and modify them after I've got judgments wrong? I thought that, so Iowa, New Hampshire, the US economy is doing great. The Iowa caucus comes along and it is a total shambles for the Democratic Party because they can't work out who's won, and they've got some new technology and it is just hopeless. And I'm up there and I think to myself, and I go to a couple of Biden events because there are so many, you know, in little schools, you can get to see and know all the candidates. It is an extraordinary example of sort of almost like village democracy. It's town halls, small meetings, you see them up close. And I thought Biden was absolutely hopeless. I thought this man cannot win the presidential election. He barely knows what day of the week it is. He'd had zero focus. And I thought that this is going nowhere. And then the pandemic comes along, and this is a very abbreviated form. And in April, I was one of 12 journalists in the briefing room at the White House because the numbers had been cut right back because of COVID. And it was like you were having a personal one-on-one with the President of the United States. It really was intimate, only 12 people. And because Donald Trump is not having visiting heads of states, he chose to be in the briefing room for the best part of 2 hours. And that was the night that he talked about injecting disinfectant into the body and sunlight. And I thought, this is surreal. Have I heard correctly what he's just said? And I think that one of the more boring jobs that must be as a press officer for a corporate is to be the press officer for a bleach company. I mean, if you're working for Domestos, what is the most interesting press release you're ever going to send out? It's not going to be exciting. And that night, the press officer for Clorox, which is the equivalent in the US of Domestos in the UK, is writing a press release saying, whatever you do not listen to the President of the United States. He's wrong. It will kill you. And you just think, holy crap, this is bonkers. This is bonkers. And I don't think that Donald Trump lost the election because of COVID. I do think people, because of the erratic handling of it, and and if I'm going to talk about another surreal moment, I was outside the Walter Reed hospital when Donald Trump was there being treated for coronavirus. And suddenly I'm conscious of the road behind me. I was doing a live on the 10 o'clock news with Michelle Hussein. Conscious that this highway behind me has gone very quiet. Sure enough, the police have come and closed all the roads. And there is Donald Trump on a COVID joyride, driving up the street at about 5 miles an hour, just waving. A car comes right by where we're standing to wave to all his supporters. And I didn't know whether it was him thanking his supporters or him in need to heal the crowd one more time. Well, I suspect
well,
in the beast.
it's interesting what you say about the roar of the crowd, because he lives on these rallies, has lived on these rallies. It has been a presidency of self in a way. It's been all about him, and it's been all about the adulation. I mean, he is a man who was still obsessing in the Oval Office 3 years after his election about the size of his inaugural crowd compared with Barack Obama's, and trying to prove that the photographs had been faked. I mean, what do you say about that? But what struck me, John, watching partly in person over there at the climax of the election, and partly, of course, from your reports and others through the year, when we got to the end there and the end game, there was an enormous feeling that this man was now alone. I mean, despite the adulation, despite some of the lickspittle people on, particularly on Fox, but not only, who interview him as if he's, a god who will never lose his powers, there was a sense that here was a man who was shrinking away and from whom people were beginning to move. And by the time, the day after the election, not in the East Room on the night, he went into that briefing room that you've just described. Any fan of the West Wing will know it well. And he gave this extraordinary performance where he said, "The system is corrupt." That's the President of the United States talking. And there was, if memory serves me right, one solitary press officer standing at the side. There was no vice president. There was no chief of staff. I think he was in lockdown at the time for having had a positive test. I may be wrong about that. But he was a man, and he looked alone. Did you get that feeling?
So that's a great question. And let me try and describe the arc of it, because you talk about Sean Spicer at the top. I was at that first briefing when Sean Spicer storms in and says, the crowds were bigger and there will be consequences if you don't report this properly, that Donald Trump had the biggest inauguration crowd in the history of the United States of America. And you thought...
Which we know for a fact is not true. I mean, you and I were at both those inaugurations, and we know it.
And it immediately gave me a challenge in my reporting, which I'm honestly, and I think that we'll come on to talking about the role of the media, but I said immediately to my bosses in London, we have to call this. We can't say on the one hand, on the other, they claim this, the other side claim that. We just have to say it's not true. And that was a big call at the start of someone's presidency. Yeah. on Saturday evening at the briefing where he made the claim. And the next day I was doing the reports for the Sunday bulletins. And I said, we've got to call it. We can't just equivocate on this, because otherwise we are not helping the audience understand. And Sean Spicer was a joke. I mean, few days later, Sean Spicer, when he's got some difficult thing to handle, is literally found hiding in the bushes in the White House grounds so that he doesn't have to talk to us, the media.
This is the White House press secretary, just to remind you.
White House press secretary. There are bits of it that at that stage seem slightly comedic. I would argue that after November the 3rd, it becomes a lot more serious, because just so that people who are tuning into this understand, the claims that were being made by the president were that there was systemic fraud, that the system was rigged, that he won by a landslide. And people will think, well, then there must be smoke. There's no smoke without fire. There's got to be something there. Well, the head of election security, cybersecurity, within the Department of Homeland Security, who Donald Trump appointed, who is a Republican, said it was the safest election on record. The Attorney General, William Barr, who was less than straight over his handling of the Mueller report and said it gave Donald Trump a completely clean bill of health, which it did not, came out and said there was no fraud, this election was fair. The FBI said the same as well. The Trump campaign, entirely within their rights, took out legal cases, 62 of them, which, apart from one on a minor technicality, every one of them was thrown out of court, including 2 that went to the Supreme Court. So, and I could go on. The electoral colleges, states, certified the results as fair. Brad Raffensperger, who I was talking about, who certified the Georgia result, who had contributed to the Trump campaign, a Republican, it was fair. What I found unbelievable is that there were 140 Republican congressmen and women who have been elected, who refused to certify the results because it was unfair. If you believe that the United States is a democracy, and as a democracy is a country of laws, laws are decided and adjudicated by judges. The judges had decided it was fair. The election officers had decided it was fair. The secretaries of state for each state declared it was fair, and 140 lawmakers in Congress were going to take it upon themselves to say it was not a fair result. I find that incredible. And that's, so you talk, Sean Spicer at the beginning, comedic, you get to the end, not quite so funny.
Presumably, you would take the view, which a lot of people watching this have taken, that the reason that many of those Republicans took that stance, disreputable though it may be in your terms, as you've described it, was simply out of fear, because every member of the House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years. And the idea was, well, if you don't support the president, whether you believe him or not, you're going to find a primary opponent, a Trumpist, who will come and knock you off your perch in 18 months' time.
Yes, and I don't know whether you're aware of this. Today, Jim, the minority leader, so the leader of the Republicans in the House, has gone to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring.
Well, there we are. Listen, I want to come on. We must come on to Joe Biden in a moment.
To finish my point. But Kevin McCarthy has gone to Mar-a-Lago today, and Trump, the Trump people absolutely adore the optics of that, because they think it shows that Donald Trump is still in charge. Yes, there is an absolute fear. There are two things. There are two forces at play. One is that Donald Trump has very much worked on the basis that, you know, I don't know whether he's ever read The Prince by Machiavelli, but I would have guessed not.
No.
Whether he studied the Medicis, again, I would guess not. But he has gone with the maxim that it is better to be feared than loved. And Donald Trump, they are terrified of him. They are terrified of what he might do, whether, I mean, not so much now. You know, he can't launch a Twitter storm against you because he's off Twitter. But he can cause a degree of mayhem. And I think that that is something that puts terror into people's hearts. And the other thing is, you know, on the BBC, when Donald Trump signed the peace deal with the UAE, I went on the screen and I said, I think this is a huge foreign policy victory for Donald Trump, and massively significant. The first, you know, peace deal with an Arab country since 1994. And we call it, and when he did good and when the economy was going great, I said, hats off to him. And when he told untruths, we said there were untruths. If you are listening to the American media, that is not the diet you are given. You are either watching Fox News, in which case Donald Trump can do no wrong, or you're watching even further to the right news organizations like OAN and Newsmax, or you're watching CNN, which used to be BBC-like, yeah, but I think they monetized the extent to which they were anti-Trump. And so that people just hear their own views echoing back to them, and nothing that ever challenges their views. And if you listen to the Today program, which, you know, you and I, you've been on for donkey's years, you hear views you don't like. Oh, I'm going to throw the thing at the radio. I can't bear this man. Why is he there? We put on people whose views we challenge from all sides. And in America, that has gone.
I want to ask you in a moment, before we get on to Biden, what's going to happen to the chunk of people who appear to be irreconcilable, the people who really supported, you know, the characters who went into the Capitol building and wanted to get their hands on some Congress people? I mean, what would have happened if Pelosi, Speaker of the House, had been in her office? You know, I mean, there would have been violence done. But sorry, yes, you want to come in on that?
Not just Pelosi, they were singing, they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence," who was presiding over it. They thought that Pence, who has been this absolutely unbelievably loyal figure, that he should go as well.
What I just want to ask you is just a simple one, John, in a way. You indicated when you talked about the Machiavelli's A Prince that Donald Trump's not noted for his literary expeditions, nor indeed his knowledge of history. He's unquestionably the least well-read president, at least in the last 100 years. I mean, that's not a controversial statement, it's a fact. When you were dealing with the people in the White House, people who were deeply, deeply committed to him with a deep personal bond, others who may have kind of fetched up there because, well, it's the White House and they didn't believe it all, but they were willing to hitch their wagon to a star, and indeed members of the cabinet who came and went, Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, all the rest of them. What was it like towards the end, behind the veil that is put down over the White House?
So I think that the class of people, there were two classes of people. There were the grown-ups who believed that it was their duty, responsibility, that if the President of the United States calls, that you serve to the best of your ability, and it is your patriotic duty to do so, and you go into that job knowing it is going to be difficult, but believing that on key issues you can affect the decision making and you can restrain some of the wilder impulses, because Donald Trump is a politician who acts on gut and impulse. And I've got to say, as a gut politician, for the most part, he is brilliant. I mean, he gets the mood of the people. You know, you go back to 2016 and Hillary Clinton had endless qualitative polling and quantitative polling, and Donald Trump just knew. And his messaging was superb. I mean, you know, you might not have liked the messages, but they were very clear what he wanted to do. So you get the people who would describe themselves, first of all, as patriots and who are doing their duty and serving the country. And I think Mattis would put himself in that category. Tillerson would put himself in the category. Actually, can I come back to Tillerson in 1 minute, Jim? Because
yes.
The treatment of Tillerson is just epic.
His firing is a great story.
His firing is just unbelievable. So Tillerson is another one. And then there were the people who were, I'm just hitching my wagon to Donald Trump. And I don't care what he does. I don't care what norms he breaches. I don't care which lines he crosses. I'm going to be there for my man. And I think he's great. And I think the fact that he's poking an eye in the establishment, at America, all the rest of it, I'm in for anything. I'm in for anything, and there's no line that he cannot cross. And I think what happened on November the 3rd, when Donald Trump tried to marshal the argument that the election had been stolen from him, that it was all a fraud, that he was the rightful victor, that he won by a landslide, that Joe Biden was really a puppet of the Communist Party, which was the other thing that people were saying to me endlessly, that he is paid for by Beijing. Joe Biden is a Marxist. Everyone knows he's a Marxist. And you just think this is...
I mean, Joe Biden wouldn't get into the Lib Dems.
I think, exactly. I think those people took over the White House. So the White House was just becoming an ever shrinking circle, and the only people that were left were the group of diehards, Trump is right on everything, the cult supporters. And I think that robbed the White House of people who there were a few who tried, you know, there was Pat Cipollone, who's the general counsel, who was trying to tell Trump, you can't do this, and convince Trump. I just saw we had a question from Fabienne there, you know, did Trump pardon himself? No, he didn't, because his general counsel said that will lead to a far, far more trouble for you than if you don't do otherwise. Just let me, Rex Tillerson, he was the Secretary of State. He was the chief executive of Exxon, so one of America's most storied companies. He gets taken into the White House, but Trump decides after a very short time that he doesn't quite like him. There was then an incident where there was a meeting at the Pentagon and Trump was demanding something or other. Trump leaves the room and Tillerson, can I say this, Jim?
Yes, you can. I think you should.
Okay. Well, Tillerson calls Trump a fucking moron. And word leaks that that's what he said. And, well, initially it leaks that he just called him a moron. And so Trump finds out about it, seething, tells Tillerson he's got to go and clear up this mess. Except Tillerson gives what is in the trade known as a non-denial denial. He doesn't deny that he says it. So Trump's furious. He then goes to, it's the same day as the shootings in Las Vegas. He goes to Las Vegas, where there's the terrible, terrible guy that was in the Mandalay Bay Hotel and opens fire, and it's the worst mass shooting incident in American history. Trump goes down there, thinks he's done a great job consoling people, gets back on Air Force One, and on Fox News, Tillerson is still the headline, not Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is seething. So anyway, Tillerson goes on this trip to Europe, and trip to Africa, I'm sorry. And on the way back from Africa, Trump fires him by tweet. But Rex Tillerson is old school. He doesn't have Twitter on his smartphone. And so they land at Andrews Air Force Base, and his aides turn on their phones and think, holy crap, our boss has just been fired by the president and he doesn't know. One of us is going to have to tell him that he's no longer in the job. And there was then a huddle of the senior executives, and they don't know what to do about it. And that's how Tillerson was fired.
We'll get more questions pouring in, but I want, before we get to that point in 5-10 minutes, just to move to Joe Biden, that well-known Marxist. As you were saying, in New Hampshire, I mean, I was there too, and he came fifth in New Hampshire. He'd gone off to South Carolina before the results came in because he knew what was going to happen, and he pulled it round, as you reported graphically at the time, in South Carolina, went on. The rest is history. Now, Biden has started with a flurry. Executive orders, reversing Trump orders, which you can do without legislative approval. They're pushing legislation in the Senate, where, of course, the Democrats have a 50-50 position with a casting vote of the vice president. Just give us a feeling about the pace that he's setting, one, just briefly. And secondly, give us a thought as to how he begins to try to pull back into, if you like, a mainstream national democratic conversation. Some of those, not all of them clearly, who are at the moment still flirting with the idea that the election was a con.
I think that look, there are real battles, and I don't want to get into a sort of civics lecture about, the Constitution and the filibuster rule and all the rest of it. But, all the time that Joe Biden can issue executive orders, fine. But he was hoping that he would be able to undo some of Donald Trump's immigration policies tomorrow. And that has all been called off because there are limits to what a president can do. And he does need the cooperation of, he needs to get legislation through the Senate. And that might require working with Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, and some of the others, if he wants to get his legislation passed. It is going to be terribly, terribly difficult because most big legislation requires a supermajority of 60 senators. It's 50-50. Getting 10 Republicans to join forces with the Democrats is going to be really, really difficult. And so I think that although Biden, I said at the start, I said in my diary, and I said during our conversation, Jim, that, in January and February, I thought he was hopeless. Actually, by the end of November, I thought no one else could have beaten Donald Trump but Biden. And the fact that he seems a consensual figure, a grown-up, someone who is going to lower the volume, lower the temperature, I think all of that is true. But, I think the idea that he's going to get Republican senators to agree, even though American democracy has been at the abyss, I think is very optimistic. And I think that I think doing big things will be really difficult for the Biden administration.
Let me put an optimistic view in the context of this conversation anyway. I spoke the other day to Evan Osnos, who, as you know, writes for The New Yorker and is his biographer, who said, look, I put this to him and he agreed that in a curious way, Biden has a good chance of being a better president at 78. He's 80 at the end of next year now than he would have had if he'd been elected in 1988, where his campaign blew up before it had started, partly because he plagiarized Neil Kinnock. I mean, there you go. Anyway, but partly because of his age, his experience, of course, 32 years in the Senate, 8 years as vice president. But he's almost certainly going to be a one-term president, probably by choice. So he's a free agent. He's also Uncle Joe, you know, the man from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And if the main task is to lower the temperature, calm the anger, get people on board, then possibly what you need at this moment of fissure and maximum anger actually is a Biden figure, not some young whippersnapper, you know.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I think he will do everything he can to pursue his agenda as much as possible. And it's very different already that you're seeing from Donald Trump's in terms of, you know, environment, which Donald Trump said, you know, was a hoax, that global warming was a hoax. You've got a much more serious-minded, you've got a much more technocratic administration, which funnily enough, just before this chat, I bumped into a very senior diplomat I know, and I said, how's it going? And he said, it's good and it's bad. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, good, it's predictable. Bad, under the Trump days, we could just shortcut the whole system. We'd go around the back of this one or that one, get to the key figure and be able to have a conversation. And now you've got people who really know their shit, and they know that there is a chain of command, and you cannot do that. And so we're back to having to do politics the old way, whereas it was the Wild West when Donald Trump was the president. Can I just... So I'm just
still do.
distract myself.
Dive in.
I had breakfast with the US ambassador at Winfield House in Regent's Park a little while ago. So Donald Trump's appointee, a billionaire, Woody Johnson, who is the scion of the Johnson & Johnson empire, so extremely wealthy. And he was pontificating on Brexit, that it was going to be the start of a great Victorian age for the United Kingdom. And then he starts talking about the Queen and Theresa May. And Woody Johnson goes, Donald Trump likes the Queen because she's a winner, but he doesn't like Theresa May because she's a loser. And I thought, this is sort of really odd. Anyway, on the Brexit stuff, we then have a conversation about the Brexit trade deal that could be negotiated. Now, Jim, you and I, over the course of our long careers, have had lunches and breakfasts with cabinet ministers, prime ministers, occasionally members of the royal family. Something happens at this breakfast with Woody Johnson that has never happened to me before. It is me, Woody Johnson, and one other official. He rolls up his trouser leg. And I'm thinking, is this a Masonic Lodge thing going on? So he rolls up his trouser leg and says, do you see this? And I say, no, I have no idea where this conversation is going. He said, no, because that was microsurgery performed by my surgeons in New York City. And he rolls his trouser leg higher. And he said, do you see that? And I see a sort of purple scar on his leg. And he said, that's what your National Health Service did to me. And he was saying this in the context of why the National Health Service should be open to negotiation as part of the Brexit trade deal of getting access, you know, American pharmaceutical companies should be able to get in. And I ended my diary entry for that day saying, like the ambassador's leg, I suspect the NHS will be on the table.
Well, before I bring in, there are loads of questions, John, let's get stuck into them. I just want one last
99 past questions.
A sort of memory from last year. And the diary, I should say, is really the story of the 20 campaign. That's what it is. But all with John's reflections from, you know, years in Washington before that, and indeed political reflections from this country as well. So all his wisdom brought. If you just had to choose one brief memory in a sentence, you've described the famous press conference. What is the image that sticks with you from that campaign?
I think it's election night and Trump thinks he's won, and then Fox News of all channels. Fox News screwed everything for Trump because they called Arizona for Biden. And I think the Trump dream of just bullying his way to victory fell apart. And that's when all the difficulties got greater. And that's when they started doubling down on all this stuff about the fraud and the cheating and the voting machines and all the rest of it. And maybe if I was allowed a secondary one,
okay,
it would be Rudy Giuliani at that news conference in the RNC headquarters, where the dye is running down his face in rivulets, and you thought, oh my God, this is the legal team of the President of the United States. And it was a shuddering shit show. And it was just, and you just think,
a man who's now being sued for 1.3 billion by the makers of the machines, the electoral machines, which he said they deliberately. John, I'm going to bring in questions. Let me just start with this one. And it's a nice one that came in early from someone called Chris, doesn't give another name, so I don't know if it's a he or a she. But anyway, Chris asks, look, as a politics teacher, I struggle to explain that it hasn't always been this way. And this is a very fundamental question, I think, in the context that we're having this discussion. My question is, has Trump changed politics forever?
I think that we were glib in 2016 when we thought that the presidency would change Donald Trump, and instead of which Donald Trump has changed the presidency. That said, so far, and I know we are only 8 days in, there is a feeling of normality, and there is a feeling of the temperature having dropped a bit, and that some form of normality has been returned. I say it, it is very, very early days. But I don't think that people should think that I think that I don't think that what we've seen is the strength of American democracy. I've seen some people argue that what happened was that Donald Trump tried to bend the system, and when it looked like it was going to snap, the guardrails moved into place, and Brad Raffensperger and in Georgia and someone else in Michigan didn't do what they had to do. Mike Pence performed his constitutional role. I think 2020 election showed the fragility of American democracy.
Yes.
If you have a president who is not going to play by the rules, and the Constitution, brilliant, fantastic document that it is, was written by gentlemen farmers and philosophers who thought that the people in charge of the country would play by the rules and would be gentlemen as well. And I don't think it ever anticipated a Donald Trump type figure. Frankly, someone more artful and more cunning could have probably overturned that election result. And one shudders to think what would have happened if, instead of it being 5 states, it was, say, Michigan or Pennsylvania, and it all swung on that one state.
David Edney, who's joined us this evening to watch this, asks a very pertinent question. If the Republicans had been in the majority in the House, would they have voted to overturn the result? I mean, I think that's an extremely sharp question. What do you think?
David, it's a brilliant question. I think they might well have done. I think the pressure would have been immense because of the electoral system in the House, where you're facing election every 2 years, and as Jim said, you could be primaried and face a more Trumpian person if you don't vote that way. I think it would have then ended up at the Supreme Court, and although it has a 6-3 majority, I think that the justices on the Supreme Court, who are there for life, who do not have to worry about Twitter storms, who don't have to worry about re-election, I think they would have probably stopped it. But I think your question underlines and underscores just the fragility of American democracy at this particular moment.
It is fragile. I mean, my book, unlike yours, John, is a meander really over half a century since I first set foot in the country. And one of the things, I begin with the observation, which is unchallengeable, I think, that the country is more divided now than at least since the Vietnam era, which I saw the tail end of, and maybe more divided even than it was then, although that was something which split families and split communities and so on. I mean, the division, someone else asks, I've just passed on from it, but I was just... what if you were to describe the anxiety that is gripping America at the moment? What do you think most Americans are most anxious about, the majority of Americans?
Well, I think that, so I saw some polling data this week suggesting, which some people took as terrible and ominous and worrisome, that 10% of all American adults say they will never ever accept Joe Biden as their president and that he's illegitimate and all the rest of it. if the corollary of that is that 90% of them will accept that Joe Biden is the legitimate president, I think that's a hell of a lot better than a hell of a lot better place than we were a couple of weeks ago, when people were saying, it's fraud, it's this, it's that. So, I think that people will come to terms with it, and I love America. You love America. I hope that this will be seen as an aberration, and that the country will bring itself back from the brink. But I think the domestic terrorism thing is real, and I think there is a real anxiety. Since 9/11, the whole national security disposition of the United States has been to believe that the greatest threat comes from jihadists abroad. Now it is seen to be white, far-right people living in America that pose the greatest threat to the state. And it seems unarguable given the events at Congress on January the 6th.
You touched on this question, John, earlier, but I think it's one that will be in a lot of people's minds joining us this evening. It comes from Danny Boyle. Now, I don't know if that's Danny Boyle, if you see what I mean. Well, it is Danny Boyle, clearly. But which Danny Boyle, we're not sure. But anyway.
It's as real as any Danny Boyle.
It's Danny Boyle, yeah, exactly. In the book, he says, you express some exasperation at Trump's behavior and so on, as you have tonight. How do you manage, and this is a question that we all get frequently, but it's particularly relevant to you and the role you've been in the last year. How do you manage to keep your personal opinions about him, and we know what that means, out of BBC reports and other situations where you think you have got to push it? And you illustrated one, I think, with the question of the photographs. But how do you cope with it? Because it's really difficult. We all know it's difficult, but I think in the spotlight that you've been in, it's especially difficult.
Yeah. So, and when you're abused and you're called fake news and you're called a liar and you're called all these other things, you want to rail against that, because I haven't. If I'd wanted to be a propagandist, I'd have gone into politics. I've gone into journalism because I think there is I do happen to believe there is a thing called truth, and I will be guided by what I think are reasonable judgments based on the evidence available. And I am not offering opinions on whether I like Donald Trump or don't like Donald Trump. Actually, Donald Trump has been fantastic for me. I've written 3 books in 6 years. I never anticipated I would write 1 book on the Trump era. So it's been, in some ways, it's been the best of times. But I don't think I'm serving the audience well if I retreat into sort of, false comparisons. Well, some people say this and some people say that. And I think I've got to call it. And I think,
isn't it also true, John, just to interrupt there, isn't it also true that when you're dealing with somebody like Trump, who behaves daily in a melodramatic manner, actually, all you have to do is describe what he's doing. Now, some people may regard that as attacking him because sometimes it's pretty embarrassing. But, I mean, he's so off the wall that if he just explained to people calmly what he has done in the last 24 hours,
you don't need hyperbole. I have noticed that I'm getting quite good at arching an eyebrow or just letting the corner of my mouth reveal the slightest smile when I did some of the reporting on it. But I really passionately believe that it's not my job to get angry. I'm not Donald Trump's opponent. I'm not Donald Trump's fan either. I'm there just to report and hold power to account, which is the traditional job of journalists. And whether I'm reporting, more challenging reporting on Donald Trump than reporting on Theresa May, probably. But in one case, I would say that Donald Trump is fantastic to report on. I remember the major moments of British politics that you and I have discussed on the air over the decades, Jim, where you suddenly see at a dramatic moment, us falling out of the exchange rate mechanism, the financial crash, where the curtain gets pulled back a bit, and you suddenly see the grown-ups are really not sure what they're doing, and there is chaos, and they're frightened the banks might fall over, or whatever. With Donald Trump on a daily basis, you know what he's thinking. You know whether he's...
Well, this is the point, isn't it? He is the most transparent president we have ever known. And his promise, in a way, it always seems to me, trying to sum him up in my last chapter, was that his real promise to people in 2016 was a very simple one. And it was, you will always know what I'm thinking.
Yeah. You will always know what I'm thinking.
You will know.
And also, you will also know that for the most part, I always thought that Hillary Clinton, she went into the 2016 election with a series of subsidiary lines, but no top line of a policy. And Donald Trump went in with a series of top lines and nothing to back them up. I want to build a wall. I want to keep Muslims out. I want to rebuild our military. I want to renegotiate trade deals. Actually, if you were going to mark him on what he said he would do and what he did, it wasn't that far off. He did build a lot of wall. He did make it much more difficult for Muslims to come to the country. I'm not saying that's a nice thing to do or a good thing to do. He also did, there were also the egregious things like separating children from their parents and creating thousands of orphans, which I think is, I say in my book, I think is totally unforgivable. That the state didn't have the bureaucratic wherewithal to carry out a policy like that and make a note of where the mothers are and where the children are.
There's also a broader question, which I suspect is what lies behind the next one I'm just going to mention. And that's the question of what we call these days, I suppose it's a pompous phrase, the public realm, or the question of how national discourse is carried on, because that's changed fundamentally in the States in the last 4 years at his urging. Helen Webb asks this question: what should the press, public and political elite, she says, in the UK learn from the Trump term of office?
What they should learn is that democracy is fragile and that you cannot take for granted that you can say what you like, do whatever you want to, and assume that everything will return to normal at a given moment. And I think that is, I think America had a very close shave on January the 6th. And also, not just January the 6th, let's not just make it the mob and the unruly elements who went to Capitol Hill. There were people who should have known better, who gave succor to the suggestion that the election had been stolen. And I think that was really, really, they wanted to ingratiate themselves with the president. And I think that, so many of them never really believed what they were saying about the election being stolen and fraud. They were just trying to suck up to the president. And I think that's a pretty parlous and worrisome state of affairs.
A huge number of questions. I'm trying to sort of zip through them and pick out a few themes. One very simple one, and answer it briefly if you can. Do you think he'll run again?
I think it's a long way away. I think that he's got all sorts of, I think that, he no longer has the bully pulpit, as Teddy Roosevelt used to call the kind of position of being president of the United States. I think that he's got a whole pile of problems that are coming down the road at him, which are going to be difficult. He's got huge debts. Will anyone bank with him anymore? He's got all manner of problems. And I think 2024 is a long way away. I would say, though, does Trumpism continue? That's a question that's coming up all the time, yeah. I don't think Trumpism exists without Trump.
Well, let me put this to you, John, and it's following up the questions on this as well. Just to pick you up on that point, I know Democrats who would say, if they were being honest, that what they really fear in the future is a clever Trump. Somebody who touches those nerves that Trump was able to touch and exploit in 2016, but to do it with a background perhaps in coherent policymaking, with more ability, with the ability to avoid some of the elephant traps that he dug for himself. And somebody I know, ex-State Department, said to me that what made him happiest, and he was happy he lost, didn't tell me how he voted, but he was happy Trump lost. And he said the big relief for people like him was that the Trump administration had been so incompetent. If it had been more competent, he said, much more damage would have been done. Now, what if you got Tucker Carlson from Fox News as the candidate, a really clever person pursuing that same line?
Yeah, but you see, I don't think that they will get the latitude. That Tucker Carlson is extremely well known because he does this Fox Evening show, but he's not the billionaire, swaggering playboy. And you've just got to say that Donald Trump was given a latitude that I have never seen any other politician. I mean, Boris comes a bit close to it, but even Boris has found out that there is such a thing called gravity. But Donald Trump was able to defy every norm. And And I think that actually January the 6th was even a line that Donald Trump couldn't cross. And so I don't think that it's immediately obvious that Donald Trump runs in 24, or that there is see, I think if Tucker Carlson ran, he would be a much more conventional Republican, and he would run more as a conventional Republican. And although that he's been given a lot of support to Donald Trump over the last 4 years, I don't think he's a Trumpian. And so I think that, and I'm not sure I believe that Don Jr. is the natural, there are some issues with Don Jr., which I think wouldn't bear very close scrutiny. And I'm not sure Ivanka is that person, although she's apparently moving to Florida and is eyeing up challenging Marco Rubio for his Senate seat in a primary contest. So look, I don't think the Trumps. I think the Trump's main priority now will be to keep their business empire intact from the mountain of debt that they've got and the reputational damage that's been done.
Well, a lot of people are touching on this in questions. It's going to be quite a difficult time, potentially legally, for him. Now, there are 2 points here. I take it from what you said that you do not think that he will be convicted in a Senate trial in impeachment. But there is a pile of potential legal difficulties facing him, financial and other, aren't there?
Yes. So Donald Trump hasn't been pardoned, but even if what Gerald Ford did after Nixon left was that he pardoned Richard Nixon so that the national nightmare, as he called it, would come to an end. Nothing has been done like that yet for Donald Trump, and I can't see why Biden would do it. Although if you get pardoned, you have to accept that you're guilty of certain crimes. So Donald Trump is still legally liable for what happened in office. And even if he were pardoned, that only pardons you from federal crime. So you have the district attorney in New York, Cy Vance, going about his work, trying to look at whether the Trump businesses broke the law and whether Donald Trump has culpability for that. You could have what happened in Georgia, where we've discussed about him trying to interfere in the election certification process. Could he be prosecuted for that? You have also got what happened in Washington, D.C., where the D.C. Attorney General is looking at whether Donald Trump broke the law in inciting the riot that led to the storming of the Capitol. So there's legal exposure on a big scale. Now, I don't know how it will shake itself down, but, do we get hold of Donald Trump's tax returns and finally see them? Do we find out who that $400 million of debt, who the creditor is on that? Because there is still a mystery around that. So I think that Donald Trump has a fair, and on top of that, you've got the pandemic, which has seen all his hotel revenues go through the floor. I thought one of the funniest things was when there was serious talk that after the inauguration, that he was going to fly to Prestwick, because you're part of the world, and he was going to go there because he just wanted to get away and he hadn't been to Scotland. And apparently Nicola Sturgeon said, "You're very welcome, Mr. President, to come, but the golf courses will be shut." He abandoned all thought of going to Scotland.
I don't think she ever said you'd be very welcome. Yeah. I think she said golf wouldn't be an excuse. Listen, yes. There's a question here which I want to dive in and just answer first before you do. Simon Dixon asks, Nixon versus Trump, who wins in a fight? Well, Simon, I was there for the last stage of Watergate. I was a student at the time and watched the whole thing. If you look and have therefore been obsessed by it ever since, Nixon resigned, of course, in August 74 in disgrace to avoid what would have been a certain impeachment conviction in the Senate. Barry Goldwater told him he had 3 votes. Watergate, compared with the Trump era, was a Sunday school picnic. And the sort of things that John's been describing and the potential legal pitfalls that Trump faces. And as he said, Cyrus R. Vance Jr., the district attorney for the Southern District of New York, i.e. in Manhattan, has got his eyes on very many people in the Trump circle and particularly on Trump himself. Nixon was a school child playing at it compared with what we've seen. Would you agree with that? Haven't given you much choice.
I think that it's unarguable, and Nixon was a sort of. look, arguably in the 1960 election, there was voter fraud, and Nixon should have rightly won that election against JFK.
But the reason he didn't, it's confidently said by people who know about these things, the reason he didn't is he knew it was happening on both sides.
Yeah, but arguably there was much more of a case there than there was in 2020. And yeah, I mean, look, what Donald Trump has run America as though it is still a private company, and that he's not answerable, and he doesn't have to play by the rules. And you've had all these different people saying that the things that Donald Trump tried to do were illegal, repeatedly, all the way through. But although it was seen as sort of low stakes, slightly jokey at the start, I think it all changed on November the 4th and 5th, when there were people who were saying to Donald Trump, look, you've got no path, you have lost the election, you need to accept it. And Donald Trump thought he knew that he had to accept it. And then he just decided, I'm not going to. I can't accept that I'm a one-term loser. I've got to double down. I've got to fight. I'm going to maintain this ridiculous argument that I won the election. And that is what took America, Donald Trump's inability to say, I lost, is what has cost him, what has cost America.
And the unanswered question, which hangs in the air, is whether he really has accepted it inside that he has lost.
I think he might know inside, but he's never going to admit it. He's never conceded. He has never said, I lost the election. I'm fascinated to see what the letter is that he has left behind for Joe Biden. Because the Biden people are saying it is a gracious and generous letter. Does he say, congratulations, Joe Biden, you won the election? Yeah. And I cannot wait to get my hands on that letter to see whether there is any acceptance, reconciliation to the truth, reconciliation to reality. Because at the moment, Donald Trump seems to be in denial and has nearly cost American democracy because of that.
Which leaves us, as ever with Trump, a number of unanswered questions. In fact, particularly a number of unanswered questions from all our marvellous viewers tonight on this webinar. The 3 bookshops, Village Books in Dulwich, the Seven Oaks bookshop, and the bookshops in Chorleywood and in Gerrards Cross. There's one question I want to get in, and it comes from somebody who says, here's another beauty, which I think is a reference to you, quoting the president at you in the briefing room. And it says, okay, Sopes, when are Spurs going to win the league?
There's been a message that I saw flash up from Stu Goodall, who said that was clearly offside. And I think he might have guessed that I might have on in the background the Spurs-Liverpool game, and that my eyes...
There is, I should say...
So Stu Goodall, I put my hands up. Guilty as charged. I think this season any one of 6 clubs could win the Premier League, but Naughtie, not Arsenal.
Well, I was going to admit that I'm talking to you from Edinburgh, but John and I have a certain North London rivalry, which we will not go into for reasons I would rather not discuss it. John, everyone will love your book who's been watching. There it is. Unprecedented. We'll pass over what he's done to the English language in the title. While you're at it, can I suggest a nifty little paperback that takes you back in 50 years of wanderings, not just politics, but all kinds of things. Can I thank, just before Cheryl says a word, thank you very much, John. We're old friends. We've trod these boards before, and we've trodden many a road in America together, ended up at the same place, sometimes to our mutual surprise. But we've had great times, and I look forward to seeing you back home soon. Thank you very much indeed on behalf of everybody.
Thanks so much.
And just, I'd like to add my thanks. That was an absolutely brilliant and insightful evening. John, thank you, all the way from Washington. Absolutely a joy and a privilege to have you join us here this evening. Thank you so much. And James, brilliant evening. Thank you so much. And we're so lucky that we've got both books. We've got signed copies, and we've had a special release of James Naughtie's book, On the Road. So we have the paperback out early. All our shops have copies of these books, and we have signed plates. And of course, a lot of you will have ordered Jon's book, but there's plenty more, and we've got plenty more signed plates. So, you know, please, I'm sure you'll want to follow up, because we couldn't answer all the questions. So what a brilliant evening. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening and supporting all the bookshops. And do get your books from our bookshops. And thank you very much, Jon and James. Good night.
And thanks to all independent bookshops for what you do.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.